Tom, it's really good to see you here in Amsterdam. You were just with a number of clients talking about intangible property. And so I wanted to grab you for a minute, just ask, with Pillar 2 just around the corner, is there any reason for multinationals to be thinking about their intangible property anymore?
There is, Rodney, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, for successful companies, intangible property profits end up being a substantial portion of their worldwide income, and it has to be placed somewhere. So companies have to be conscious of making sure that they have appropriately ascribed the profits to the jurisdictions where they belong. And, notwithstanding Pillar 2, there is still some ability to get rate benefit from planning for IP. So, companies ought to have a clear vision as to what their overall IP structure is going to be and how they're going to substantiate it with tax authorities.
Okay, so it's still important. And I know you were talking to people about the transition rules. What's in there of that?
Well, it's interesting. The transition rules essentially initially created this dead period where if there was a transfer of IP between December of 2021 and implementation of the Pillar 2 rules, the transferee would take a carryover basis in the IP. And that was quite a broad rule because it applied regardless of the amount of tax that was paid in the transferring jurisdiction. In February, administrative guidance came out that really relaxed that rule. And that's quite beneficial because to the extent that the transferor is either paying an acceptable rate of tax, 15%, or is using tax attributes, deferred tax assets that otherwise would have carried over into the post-transition period, the transferee can now take a stepped-up basis. And that has taken a lot of the heat off of the transition rules. And while still facts and circumstances test to determine whether the transition rule has any bite, in most circumstances, it no longer does. So that is going to facilitate the movement of IP between now and 2024.
And I can imagine, just given the number of people that have been talking about the global controversy posture, this is probably an area where we can anticipate disputes and controversy.
Yeah, there's no question about that. So this is where BEPS 1.0 is important. I think as you're aware, BEPS 1.0 changed the transfer pricing guidelines. So there's now an emphasis on DEMPE. Where is practical control over the development, enhancement, maintenance, protection, and exploitation of IP. And the rules have both a offensive and defensive posture. So on the offensive, if you're going to place IP in a certain location, you have to make sure that you have enough people who are performing these kinds of DEMPE activities that the entity is treated as a bona fide owner and not just a financer of the development of IP. And for many U.S. companies in particular, that's not a problem if the U.S. is going to be the site of the IP. Where we find the problems is on the defensive end, which is the guidelines go on to say that other members of the multinational group that participate in DEMPE should get an appropriate return. And, as soon as I read the word appropriate in those guidelines, I said, well, that's going to be in the eyes of the beholder, right? And indeed, that's what's happened. So we see many countries are taking the view that local employees are performing DEMPE functions. And, they will gather information about, what are the different job levels and job titles in their country, and what have they been over the last several periods of years. And then they go about trying to create an argument that they are entitled to a full share of the residual profit that's generated from IP. So I think there are a couple important things to take away. First, companies shouldn't wait for the local tax authority to come in, gather facts, and make the argument. Rather, the company ought to decide where are the DEMPE roles, where are the people who have authority over the purse, and come up with an affirmative case that demonstrates where those people are. Now, in some cases, because many companies have kind of borderless management groups, they may in fact have DEMPE people outside of the location or locations where they desire to have their IP ownership. In those cases, you ought to carefully think about when those people need to have the authority or should have the authority, but assuming they do, you should come up with a pricing method that you can sustain that appropriately allocates income to those jurisdictions. And it may require some kind of profit share, although it shouldn't be a full share of all the profits, something like a share of a carried interest, that an investment fund manager may get. Or you may be able to apply cost plus, looking at public information on companies like the Carlyle Group or Blackstone to determine what kind of return on assets they get or return on costs they get, and use that to benchmark an appropriate return. So I think it's very important to establish an affirmative case and not just be reactive, because the tax authorities will come in eventually.
So this is just fascinating, Tom. I mean, so what you're telling me is, yes, there's still a point to looking at your intangible property. On the upside, the transition rules have been simplified, taking away some of the pain that people were expecting to suffer. But on the other hand, with tax authorities becoming more and more aggressive and using the DEMPE theory, people really need to be more closely examining their IP and who's contributing to that, rather than waiting for someone to come through the door.
Yes, if you don't take that last step, I think you're in for a world of hurt. Eventually you may work these issues out, but you're going to start off on your back foot. And you're going to spend a lot of time internally and maybe on external fees, if you don't get it straight up front.
Well, no wonder you're in great demand here in Amsterdam, Tom. Thank you for your time today.
Okay, good talking to you, Reddy.